Welcome everybody to my session, again, using ArcGIS Pro to efficiently, or effectively, if you will, manage data in ArcGIS Online. So what the heck does that mean, right? What am I talking about here today? Well, I'm going to be talking about the relationship, and you'll hear me use the word connection way too much today, about ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Online, and how those two fit together in the overall ArcGIS infrastructure. As well as we can talk a little bit about tips and tricks for ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Online, and how best for each individual to take a look at their data and get what they need, whether that be Pro, whether that be Online, and whatever their task may be. So I'll do a quick overview of Pro and ArcGIS Online. This was marked as a beginner course, so I'm not going to make any assumptions here today. Talk a little bit about the overview. Then we're going to talk about individually feature layers and web maps, which will parlay me into a short demo here today. And then talk briefly about publishing and how publishing is kind of the building block of putting data into ArcGIS Online as well. And then do a quick recap. Hopefully I have time for some questions here at the end. Okay. So overview, what it does. So if anybody remembers when ArcGIS Pro first became a thing, when Pro was first introduced to us, there was a couple things at the top of the list that Esri and everybody was talking about. And the first big component was that you could have multiple maps. Didn't have to have one map per MXD document, right? And everybody was cheering at the term multi-threaded. I don't think it's ever been used more in that 1 year. And then the second piece, which was also big, but maybe went a little bit unnoticed at the time, was its connection to ArcGIS Online. And that connection to ArcGIS Online has been the crux of kind of my GIS career. I don't think I open up Pro without having the intent of going into ArcGIS Online anymore, or ArcGIS Portal, but I'll briefly mention that later. And one of the things to consider with that is that when it was first put in there, you could have your account in ArcGIS Online. But now that's part of the licensing structure as well. And we're not going to talk about licensing too much, but just note that when you open up Pro and you go to your portals section, now of course, me being who I am, I have multiple portals and I could scroll and scroll and scroll there. But you notice that we have ArcGIS Online and portal connections that are saved within within ArcGIS Pro. And I can be licensed from my own personal license that ProWest kindly provides me. And then I can switch my portals to best help my clients and how I do my work, so I can switch back and forth. So this organization and collaboration between different portals is hugely important when it comes to data management, because now we can integrate multiple systems and have Portal, ArcGIS Online, all in one. And that creates a system of record. Big proponent of single source information. As you know, when there's copies of data floating around all over the place, who knows what's what, right? And we want to come up with a system of record with authoritative data where we know exactly where is the actual master data set and who is responsible. And that authoritative user and tasks, as it says up there, is what I call where, what, when, and who. A little hard to say. Everybody's used to saying what, where, and why, but of course where goes first. We are geographers, right? Where always comes first. So where is the data? What is that data? When is that data updated? And who does that updates? And those questions define data management. And when ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Online come together, that is, I think, the best way of organizing that type of information. And then, of course, we have flexibility. We can build layers in any environment. We can build them in an enterprise SDE. We can build them in Portal. We can build them in ArcGIS Online. We can build them in a file geodatabase and then put them into ArcGIS Online. That flexibility is key when it comes to your data management and wherever your organization happens to be. Do you have enterprise? No. Do you have file geodatabases? You have shape files, right? Going way back to shape files, right? And then the editing component. Obviously, we know Pro edits data, but now ArcGIS Online edits data, and it does it very well. In fact, I'm sure some of you might already know, the new ArcGIS Online update hit today. I got the notification this morning, and I was already deep diving into some stuff that I revamped this presentation this morning. So, so that's how quickly things can change. And then, of course, analysis, which, of course, we know analysis is king in Pro, but doesn't mean that it can't happen inside of ArcGIS Online. So, access. Obviously, if we're going to manage data, we need access to that data. And how do we get access? Well, of course, we can directly connect to a database or a file geodatabase, but that's boring, right? I'm talking about services. I get way too excited about services. So services can come in two different forms. We have our traditional published services, which come from an ArcGIS server where we can set the permissions, set the settings per service that we publish either to ArcGIS or either to a portal or to a standalone server and then place into ArcGIS Online. And that's where we get to configure all that nice stuff about can we edit, can we view, can we export, all that kind of jazz. But we have those same settings inside of hosted data in ArcGIS Online. Just looks a little different. Don't be scared. Different checkboxes and different things and different verbiage that all do the same things but allow for the same types of permissions to be set on the data, depending on how you want to set it up, how many things you want to have, how many data items you have inside either your enterprise or inside ArcGIS Online. And then we talk about editing. You're going to see a demo here in just a couple of minutes where I actually am going to start editing data. But that data is not going to be in enterprise. It's not going to be in a file geodatabase. It's going to be inside of ArcGIS Online. But I'm going to edit it utilizing ArcGIS Pro. And we'll be able to see the source is coming from, Pro in ArcGIS Online. You can see that the source is ArcGIS Online. Now, whether it's hosted, whether that's a published service, doesn't matter. But the data is living, and we're accessing it through ArcGIS Online, and that's where we're actually editing the data. And it will either trace its way back to a geodatabase, or it's right there in ArcGIS Online for us to edit. Temp data. Ooh, there's that word. How many here have ever created a file with the word temp in it? Everybody raise your hand. I know I do. And those temp files can actually come directly from ArcGIS Online. I'll show a workflow of that here during my demonstration as well. But creating those files that need to be processed, right? We have a subset of data that needs to be looked at. We have a process that we want to do. We can get that data out of ArcGIS Online, do that kind of process, creating a temporary file, right? And then push it right back up into ArcGIS Online without having to do anything to the data other than what we needed to do outside of the data connection. And then we have hosted versus services. We have public specific and views. So what do I mean by that? So views in general is, of course, a view of the same data. Now that view can have different permissions, or that view can also have different data in it. So say you have a data schema of 50 attributes, but we can publish that data set with only 20 of those attributes and say that it's add only or it's view only. And creating those views can happen either in your published services in that server manager, or it happens in ArcGIS Online, creating those different views. And in ArcGIS Online or through filtering, we can also filter geographically, only show a subset of data geographically versus just by attributes. And all of those are considerations for managing data in feature layers in ArcGIS Online. It's just knowing where those settings are and how to effectively manage them by who is that authoritative source, right? We're going to come back to that other word. You're going to hear connection and authoritative a lot here today. And then we're going to talk, now we're going to talk about web maps. Of course, data is king, right? If we have data, we can do stuff with it. But if we're going to build something in ArcGIS Online, we need a web map. They're the building blocks of ArcGIS Online for allowing us to view that data, edit it, and do whatever else we need to do there. But we can have that either locally, we can have maps in our Pro projects, or we can have online maps that are in our Pro projects. See that we'll see that here in a minute here after I get done blabbering. And so what are the key considerations for building web maps in the various environments? Well, the biggest one is symbology. Symbol changes can define where you do certain things. And I'm going to mention later about the different web maps of local and online. But what capabilities does online have versus Pro have for creating that symbology? So here's just a view here of a Pro screen, and we have our symbology on one side, and we have our contents pane on the other, or I should say, and what we have is a determination of the we have two things to consider. Sorry, resolution and vector symbols. So ArcGIS Online will flatten certain symbols. So we have to consider those when we're building web maps that get published or data that gets published to ArcGIS Online. It will flatten certain PNGs if we've used that, or we've built a symbol, we've built custom symbols in our Pro projects, and those can get flattened into pictures, and then they don't look so good inside of ArcGIS Online, that resolution. So we really need to consider those types and look at our styles and what we've loaded in for our symbology. Vector symbols are the best, those PNG files I mentioned briefly. Putting those in, and ArcGIS Online is getting better and better about accepting those types of symbols. And here, bringing it to our web map, we see two different things shown there. We see our map. Actually, just briefly point there. We see our map right there, and then we have that map, which has a curious little symbol on the bottom corner. And what does that mean? That symbol means that map doesn't actually live in our Pro project. We're connecting to that map in ArcGIS Online, meaning that all of its data and all of its capabilities that's inside of there is all available to us, and we can pull up that map, and I will here in a minute, and actually use that map for just like if we had built it inside of Pro. Some considerations, and there's those vector symbols, stacking symbols that I referred to earlier. But here's the considerations when we build our web maps, or web maps that we're specifically connecting to inside of ArcGIS Online. Adding and removing layers. Of course, if the map lives in ArcGIS Online, if we make a change to it, we start adding and removing layers, making updates to it, that's going to get reflected in ArcGIS Online. And while the connection between Pro and Online is strong, there are certain things that can break if we're not careful enough. So what is usually recommended, what I usually do is I build specific maps that I know are going to be used inside of Pro, and those are not actionable maps that I'm using inside of applications or for other purposes inside of ArcGIS Online. And then saving that map. Now it's all well and good. We can actually pop that map into Pro, make some changes. We're allowed to make those changes if we want to, and then hit save. But we just want to make sure that what we've done is going to work, which of course we want to have ArcGIS Online up and ready to view to make sure that map is still working. But there's always a nice little button that you can undo that, if you will. You can archive the existing map. So, you made an oops. You can go back, delete that new one, and go back to that archived version and start over. So there's a little bit of redundancy built into this process. And then changing the data sources. You're going to see here in a minute when I open up my Pro project that I'm going to see the source of data is inside of ArcGIS Online. But it doesn't have to stay that way. And that's the nice part about going between your data in ArcGIS Online and your data that might be locally on your enterprise or in file geodatabases. You can update, keep the same symbology that you've built in ArcGIS Online, swap the source to your actual data if you wish, and then make all the updates updates there. Nice little way of changing those data sources. We just want to, of course, watch the save, right? If we make that change, we can't save. We wouldn't be able to save that if it's a local copy, because then ArcGIS Online is going to yell at us. I don't know where that data is. What do you mean? What do you mean you're trying to save me? And so Pro has got some of these warnings built in to let us know if we've done something a little bit too far outside the realm. And then, of course, editing. Editing is big, of course, with data management. We want to make sure our data is up to date, on task. And so if we've published a service, we just want to make sure what those settings are and how those edits, is that version data? Is that archive data? Have we published branched versioning or traditional versioning? And just know those considerations. For those of you in the parcel fabric world, if you've used parcel fabric or no parcel fabric, that's branched versions. But when you're editing that data, you're editing it through a service. So if you have it in your Pro, or if you have it in your Pro, it's actually coming through through your portal, and it is branched versions, and so you have to consider the versioning when you're saving those edits. All right, enough of the boring slides. Let's move on to an actual demo here. So I'm going to show you where some of these things are. Like, how the heck do we actually get to that point of having our data ready and available inside of ArcGIS Online? Well, I've got this handy little signed data management project, and I want to showcase a couple different things. So if this were my signed data, so I pulled up the signed data, I cultivated this, and I'm ready to publish it into either my server or my ArcGIS Online. Well, that's where I take a look at the portal that I'm signed into. If we're going directly into a portal, or if we're going directly into ArcGIS Online, I want to be connected there. If I'm going into my portal, I want to go there. Or if I have standalone servers, I take a look at the servers folder inside of my catalog pane there and publish it directly to that server that way. And once that's done, I have a URL that I can then harvest to put either into Portal and to ArcGIS Online. But where do I actually go? Oh, if it's a standalone server, we actually go and publish. I actually don't have publish privileges to this one. So I would just right-click, and there'd be an option to publish it there. Otherwise, we go up to Share, we go to Web Layer, and we go to Publish Web Layer. Easy peasy, right? And this is where we get to fill in that lovely metadata. Yes, we got to put in that metadata and put in the location. So if this is ArcGIS Online, I can see the folder structure that's in my ArcGIS Online. If this were Portal, I'd see that folder structure. Or if I was publishing directly to a server, I would see the folders that have been configured in there. I could set the initial sharing level. You don't have to. Obviously, you can change that once it gets in there. But then we look at inside of here. Now, one of the things briefly to consider here is that when we're publishing some data, it might get published as a straight map service. But when it comes to data management, I always recommend publishing it as a feature service. Obviously, if we're going directly into ArcGIS Online here, we don't even have a map service. It just becomes a feature layer directly into ArcGIS Online. All right, yeah, it took too long. Yeah. And then I go to that pencil mark here. Again, I'll just back up there into that feature. And there's those settings, right? The same settings that are going to be inside of ArcGIS Online. When I get in there, I'm able to check those boxes and set up how I want this data to be configured going forward, how I want to be able to edit that data. And then I would just hit Analyze, of course. It's going to analyze whether you hit Analyze first, or if you hit Publish, it's going to analyze it anyway. If we get any screaming warnings, of course, those will pop up either red or orange and let us know we might have a problem with what we've published. And we can address that and hit Publish here. Obviously, I don't want to take up too much bandwidth and publish here right now, but we're going to go ahead and take a look at another way of sharing, which is share as a web map. And what's the difference here? Well, share as a web map severs that connection between the data that we have locally. Now, if we have our data in a file geodatabase, if we publish it to ArcGIS Online, of course, it's not connected to the data that we had in our file geodatabase anymore. But if we're publishing a map, it's going to save the map as it's pictured on screen and also copy the data along with it and create this kind of package that gets pushed up into ArcGIS Online. Now, that may be what you want, and I've seen a lot of organizations leverage those to great effect. But what we need to know is that when that map is published, it's singular. It's its own copy of information. So if we want to edit that information, we need to get at it somehow. Ooh, I talked about that, didn't I? We just bring that map down from ArcGIS Online and bring it back into our Pro project that we just published from, right? And why do we do that? Because now the data is inside ArcGIS Online. So not only I have access to it, my organization has access to it as well. And then let's talk briefly about that export I talked about earlier, that temporary data, right? So there we can see my source. And that little symbol there is telling me that source is coming directly from ArcGIS Online. Of course, if we had it in a geodatabase, it would show where the path is. If it was in an enterprise SDE, it would show the name of that, the name of the SQL database. But by going into the contents, right-clicking that, and hitting export, if you checked the export feature, if that data is exportable, we can not only export the entire data set, but we can also filter right on the fly and say I only want my stop signs, right? I only want my stop signs. I'm looking at those, or we'll just do these cross-only greens here for a second. I could filter my data set right here in ArcGIS Online, create that temporary file, and do what I need to do with it. And then, of course, because we're great data curators and we have global IDs, we could join that data back up with its authoritative source and go ahead and make those updates if we needed to. Or send it off because we needed to take an export and send it to somebody who needed it, right? And all that's available with data that's not on my computer. It's in ArcGIS Online. And again, the same principle will apply to Portal to a certain degree. Of course, we just know there's different versions of ArcGIS Online and Portal, so we just want to be mindful of those versions if we're trying to do similar things. And then, of course, feature templates. Of course, feature templates are very big when we're creating data sets that not only have domains in them that we're trying to help with editing, we're creating domains, but we're also setting what type of features can be created. And of course, when we go to our properties for these individual symbols, they not only allow us to set the symbology, but also set the attributes. And I am happy to report that as of today, inside of ArcGIS Online, attribute feature templates is in the map viewer, which I'll show here in a second. But that came out today, so be the first to check it out, because I know I've already done it. Of course, the only difference is that we still can't set our symbology the templates in ArcGIS Online still don't support symbology changing of the featured templates there. Of course, you can change the symbols, but that will, I believe, overwrite the feature templates. Again, still testing that inside of Map Viewer, so check back in on that, and that's always gaining traction. This is the biggest jump from Map Viewer Classic into Map Viewer. And you know what? Since we're already talking about feature templates, let's just go ahead and hop into ArcGIS Online. And let's take a look at that. Ooh, there's that new button, Configure Editing, Forms, and then we go to Templates. And there's all those signs, right? And then there's that feature template, brand new here today. Again, I told you I changed it this morning. So we can see there's those same feature templates that we had in Pro inside of ArcGIS Online. And all this flexibility, right, allows us to better curate our data, not only from ArcGIS Online, if somebody doesn't have Pro, they can get access, do these types of workflows in ArcGIS Online, or we can go back and forth, saving that data and doing the things that we need to do regardless of that data set and where we might be editing it at the given time. Of course, one of the things to consider, of course, is those views. If we set up those view filters, that's going to be on our actual content itself. Come come back to that. Oh, close that off there. So we can see I've got hosted views in there. So we've configured data from the poles or signs that's slightly different than the actual main data set and pulled the various views into the different maps as needed. Back in here, of course, say I needed to make a symbol update, right? So we can still do symbols. This is something in these tips and tricks between Pro. I've created a style inside of Pro, and I need to update a certain style inside of, but I'm inside of ArcGIS Online. I'm not very good at Pro anymore. I'm putting on I'm ignorant of Pro right now, and so I want to make that change. And some recent updates inside of ArcGIS Online are going to allow us to do that. I apologize for the, looks like bandwidth is slowing down here. Let's see if that'll, probably because there's a lot of symbols in there. But what it would show here when this pops up is we can actually bring our web styles directly from ArcGIS Online and put them into our map viewer and actually take the styles we create in Pro and update our symbols inside of ArcGIS Online from those style files. You saw those briefly here when I had this up, when I had this over here. If I go to all my contents and filter by styles, these style files are available to not only pull down into Pro, but they're also available to put into our map viewer. And it looks like I'm running a little short on time here, so I'm gonna hop in briefly to mention this, just because we're talking about data management in ArcGIS Online. And again, I got a new feature here for you guys. As of here today, this is the new web editor inside of ArcGIS Online. I'm gonna go ahead and select this sign data. And at first, I'm going to clear out the poles, and I'm going to go to Attributes. And yes, you guessed it, batch attribute editing in web editor here, folks. Big stuff here. So batch attribute editing inside of ArcGIS Online, game changer for data management inside of ArcGIS Online. Of course, batch attribute editing had to be done in Pro up till this point. This, again, brand new here as of this morning. So if we have that data available, we can now do these types of edits and figure out the question of, and as I go back to my slide deck here, the question of where or when and where that data gets edited, when, is now multiple choice. It doesn't have to be Pro anymore. It can be ArcGIS Online as these features update. I'm going to briefly go through this publishing here, so I will have a couple of minutes here for questions. We talked about the styles, of course. Loading those styles from our Pro and publishing them into ArcGIS Online is a great way to create a standardization set of symbols that your organization is going to be utilizing, whether that is in Pro or ArcGIS Online. Of course, we can load those into either the map viewer or other projects. Of course, we're keeping it standardized across the organization. And then we have our maps, of course, web layers, service layers, URLs, RESTs, service endpoints, living atlas. Where your data comes from in your web maps is something to be mindful of, because it might not always be a data connection that you have control over, but it's data that's important for that web map. Again, going back to that consideration when we're making updates, when we have connections to web maps in Pro, how is that available? How is that available, and do we have a connection to it? And then, of course, downloads. We can, of course, download that data. I showcased that briefly in the demo. But just one note of caution there with downloading data from ArcGIS Online, it does create extract files. So when you hit the download button on data, if you have the ability to do that inside of ArcGIS Online, it will actually create a file that gets downloaded separately. So you end up with two items in your ArcGIS Online, your original item, and then the extract item, whether that was a shape file or a file geodatabase that you've created. There's all different kinds of formats. It will create an extract file with a date on it. So just be mindful of that when you're doing that kind of work. You're pulling that data down, that you are creating a separate AGO item in your organization. So this is the only time I'll read directly from slides. I hate doing it, but I like to get a message across as I wrap things up. So ArcGIS Pro is a companion to ArcGIS Online and allows cloud-based organizations to use AGO and Pro for data management. Creates a connection, there's that word again, web-based content to desktop software, and helps data curators of all skill levels maintain data integrity. Of course, that where, when, what, and who, right? Do it in that form. And then I do have a couple minutes here for questions as the next person can come up and start getting ready. There's my contact information. ProWest does have a booth 18, right as you enter the doorway over here. I'm available there. And there's a list of solutions capital S, that come from the Esri Solutions Gallery that have Pro projects with style files and all that kind of good stuff in them that can be downloaded directly from ArcGIS Online. Thank you very much.